I believe we are now live, so welcome to Schoolyard Theology Class 3. Once again, our apologies for last week. We decided at the very last minute to cancel the class because there were different estimations as to how bad the air quality in fact was, and we figured, well, there could be asthmatics, there could be other things like this, so we might as well cancel. Especially because last week, I don't know if any of you noticed it who live here in Cyprus, but there was a lovely gas smell because of the gas main break in somewhere. So there was a natural gas smell which was wafting all day. And I initially thought that I was setting my kitchen on fire, but in fact, it was not something that I had done. Okay, very good. So tonight we're actually going to begin, and I meant to print this out, but I arrived back from a visit to my family in Florida at 3:30 this morning. So suffice it to say, my brain is sort of it's coming into existence slowly. Yes, there's nothing like problems with aircraft that delay your flight by 3 hours. So let's see. I had some people who asked me some questions, and I told them that I would answer those questions in brief before beginning tonight's class. Some of the questions actually overlap, so I thought it would be beneficial perhaps for you all. And I'm going to do this very briefly. So one of you asks about the question as to what it means that the discipline of celibacy for priests, what does that mean, and how does that differ from a vow? So diocesan priests, such as myself, right, ordinary parish priests, do not actually make vows of celibacy. Only religious priests, monks, friars, the Allegadni Maria priests, for instance, they are all religious priests. They make a vow of celibacy to God, a vow of chastity to God. Diocesan priests, on the other hand, make promises of celibacy. So a vow of chastity to God made by the religious, a promise of celibacy to one's bishop made by a priest. Now, what's the difference? In practice, nothing. So celibacy is celibacy, but there is a distinction between a vow one makes to God and a promise one makes to one's bishop in terms of gravity, right? So for instance, and it is possible for priests, even religious priests, to leave the priesthood and to do so well. When that happens, they petition the Holy Father for the grace of being able to live as if they were laymen. Because you see, once you're ordained a priest, that's it. You can't go back. You'll never be a layman again. But you can have the permission from the Holy Father to live as if you were a layman. And when the Holy Father dispenses diocesan priests from their promises to their bishop, that's all he's doing. It's a done deal. He just dispenses your promises to your bishop. That's all they are, promises to a bishop. Significant, no doubt. You're obligated to follow them, no doubt. But a promise made to a bishop is far less significant than a vow made to God. Now, I'm not a canon lawyer, but my understanding is that when the Holy Father dispenses religious priests, such as monks, friars, Allegadni Maria, what have you, and they want to live as if they were laymen, the wording of that dispensation, from what I've been told, again, I'm not a canon lawyer, is we dispense you insofar as we are able. Notice. The Pope can get rid of a promise you make to your bishop with the flick of a pen, but he dispenses religious insofar as he is able, because they have made a vow to God, and the Pope is not God. Thank God. Okay. Another question that was asked was substitutions in bread and wine, because I made the point that we can't use rice cakes and sake, as you will remember, and it's true. What can I say? And the person asks what about the debate of taking communion by the mouth or the hand? These are not the same thing. I think what they are trying to say is both seem to be prohibitions, but they're not prohibitions on the same level whatsoever. So the church says that you can receive Holy Communion by the hand, period. Now, that's only the truth in the Latin church, right? In the Eastern churches, you cannot receive by the hand. Communion is always given in the form of intinction, which means the consecrated bread is soaked in the consecrated wine, right? The body is in the blood, and then you actually receive on a spoon. So it is impossible to receive in the hand in the Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches. Another question is asked about outdoor masses and whether or not these require permission outside of pandemic time. I'm not sure, I'm not a canon lawyer. That gets into all sorts of interesting canonical questions. But my understanding is that, a priest can celebrate Mass outside on a canoe if he wants. There are examples of John Paul II doing this with his youth group, right? They would be traveling somewhere, and they'd flip the canoe over, and he was a priest, and he celebrated Mass for them. You have to have a significant reason to do so. Well, obviously, the pandemic is a significant reason. And now I will go to, but also canoeing with your spiritual directees is also apparently a good reason. And of course, priests such as myself, I mean, many times priests will be traveling. It's entirely legitimate for a priest to celebrate a private Mass in his hotel room, right? Okay, now, the other questions are, one person asks a question pertaining to soteriology, that is the Church's doctrine of salvation, because that person may have heard me say that the teaching of the Church traditionally is outside of the Church there is no salvation. That is the traditional formulation, which actually comes from Cyprian of Carthage, if I'm not mistaken, in very, very early, right? And the answer is that is still the teaching of the Church in one respect, right? Christ is the unique mediator between God and man. The Church is his body, full stop. If you're not in Christ, how can you be in the mediated relationship between God and man? That said, however, right, we don't know the consciences of individuals. We don't know their levels of subjective knowledge. It is entirely possible for people to be ignorant of the truth and not to be culpable thereof. So the basic answer is, we know that you need to be on the boat. But Christ, well, he can walk on water. So don't worry about what Jesus is doing, right? Just get on the boat, right? So we sink, Christ doesn't. So if Christ goes out to people outside of the boat, that is something about which we really can't say much, right? Because that's his business, he is God, but we still have an obligation to preach the gospel. Okay, and then finally, this person also asks about, once again, the discipline, the difference between the Eastern and Western churches with regard to priestly celibacy. I had mentioned that the Eastern churches allow married men to become priests, right? None of the churches allow priests to get married, ever, 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 right? Once you're ordained a priest, that's it, basta. But if you are married, if you are a married man and you are, say, Coptic or Greek Orthodox or Eastern or Byzantine Catholic, right, the discipline of the Latin Church doesn't apply to you with regard to priestly celibacy. So the discipline of the Latin Church, which is very, very ancient, and it is a discipline about imitating Christ, ultimately, right? Christ was celibate. St. Paul was celibate. Celibacy is a higher calling because it is a sign of the kingdom of God to come. In heaven, none of us will be married, period, right? So marriage is very much about this world. Celibacy points to the next world. Now, the discipline of celibacy with respect to priests does not apply to Eastern Catholics or Eastern Orthodox. In fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, 99% of the diocesan clergy are married men. It's just a different structure. Now, is that wrong? And the answer is no. It's a discipline. It's an ancient discipline of both churches. The Eastern churches have always allowed for married men to become priests, and in antiquity, married men could become bishops. We got rid of that really early on, but right, St. Paul specifically says, he's talking about himself not being married, right? And he says something to the effect of, you see, I'm not married, but Peter is. Right now, who was Peter? The first pope. We call that a bishop, right? So he is, if Peter was a married man, at least in, and completely a married man in the early part of his life, whether or not he eschewed his ordinary married life after his conversion to Christ and as he went out to spread the gospel, it is entirely not doctrinal that married men cannot become priests, and even bishops. Even that is a discipline, right? So discipline and doctrine are not the same thing. Okay, now let us go to the meat of today's class. So I have given you a handout, and I believe that handout is now online for those of you who are watching on YouTube. Now, I noticed that I'm going to bring the computer slightly closer to me because the lighting is odd. Yeah, I think this is better. Okay, so the first part is Introduction to the Pre- and Post-Lapsarian World. Lapsarian is just a fancy term meaning the fall, right? So the world prior to and after the fall, the pre- and post-lapsarian world. Just think, what is a lapse in judgment? It's a mistake, right? Okay. In order to understand the importance of divine revelation better, and we've been discussing that in these classes, right? The distinction between faith and reason, the importance of divine revelation, and we're going to continue talking about that today. We have to begin with the beginning, that is to say, with the original sin of Adam and Eve. The celebrated Catholic author and humorist of the early 20th century, G.K. Chesterton, once wrote that, and I quote, "Original sin is the only part of Christian theology which can really be proved, and we can see this in that man can feel exquisite happiness in skinning a cat." What does Chesterton mean by that? Look around you. Look at the world as it is and ask yourselves, do human beings behave well, generally speaking? Why is it that we should be almost ineluctably inclined to think and do evil? All that you have to do is to watch the news for 2 seconds, and you can see that the human race is seriously wounded in living out the moral life. We lie, we cheat, we steal, we rape, we pillage, we plunder. As the psalmist puts it, we murder the fatherless child, and then we rejoice in it. And yet, all the while, we know the moral law in the deepest core of our being. We know what we're supposed to do, and we fail to do it. For Chesterton and for the church, the only answer to this quandary, this discrepancy between what we know to be right and what we often do in fact, is that something truly calamitous has taken place in human nature, and we need some serious rescuing. It is precisely this that is meant by the effects of original sin, the human condition outside of God's grace. Now, I painted a very negative picture there, right? But deliberately so. However, I want you to know that the Catholic Church, contrary to some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, does not have a view of human nature that says that we are utterly reprobate after the fall, okay? Our human nature is not destroyed by the fall. Human nature is actually still good. It's simply good but fallen, right? And this calamitous situation has an explanation. We Catholics believe that at the beginning of human history, the first truly human couple, whom the scriptures and tradition refer to as Adam, from the Hebrew Adamah, which means soil, and Eve, Chava in Hebrew, which is derived from the Hebrew word chai, which means life. So basically you have dirt man and living lady, okay? So Adam and Eve, that's what that means basically, right? They're personal names now, but they are just dirt dude and lady who lives, okay? These were created in a state of graced friendship with God that was meant to be passed on to all of their descendants. In God's first hope for humanity, his plan A, if you will, we were meant to walk with God in harmony and peace, without any desire to sin, with ordered bodies and souls, free of physical suffering and even death itself. Had Adam, the head of the human family, gotten it right during the course of his life, then today the world would be unrecognizably different, and Adam and Eve would have passed the state of original justice to all of their descendants. And in case you're wondering, that plan A didn't work out so well. But that wasn't because of God, that was because of us. Adam and Eve, the first true humans, did something absolutely terrible. We don't know precisely what it is that they did, but the scriptures use the poetic language of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Once Adam and Eve go into rebellion against God, the situation for them changes totally. They begin to fear God and each other. They lose their easy relationship of friendship with God, and their souls and bodies begin to long for sin, for rebellion against God. In punishment for their fall from grace, they begin to experience the loss that we all experience now. They experience suffering. They experience physical death. They experience that terrible war between soul and body, which we all are so familiar with. Lastly, this fallen human condition is then passed on to all of their descendants. And of course, that means us, right? And the church calls this lovely state original sin. So from this point on, each and every human person is conceived and born into this state of original sin, the human condition outside of God's grace. So with plan A out of the picture, God turns to plan B. And let's call plan B his rescue mission. After the fall of humanity, God begins to reach out to his human creatures slowly and gradually to prepare the way for the coming of the ultimate rescuer, God himself in human flesh. And this history is what Catholics refer to as the history of salvation. First, God makes spiritual relationships or covenants with certain members of his people. For instance, after the flood, he makes a covenant with the entire human race, in whom? Noah, right? And his descendants. And then in the progress of God's rescue mission, he begins to separate one people on earth who would understand who he is correctly and worship him alone. These were the Jewish people, the descendants of God's covenant with the patriarch Abraham. This covenant is later specified in the covenant with Moses and with the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, following the exodus of the chosen people from Egypt. This separation of the chosen people is meant to prepare one group of people for whom and from whom the Messiah might come. And then, of course, in the fullness of time, when everything was ready for the coming of the Savior, God prepared one Jewish woman in a magnificent and unique way by preserving her miraculously from the stain of original sin from the very moment of her conception to be the mother of Jesus Christ, the rescuer himself. Jesus, true God and true man, is born of the sinless Virgin Mary precisely so that our wounded human condition might be cured and our souls might be saved. And so why does this story of the fall of humanity matter for our understanding of the relationship between faith and reason and the importance of this relationship for Catholic theology, which has been the overarching theme of our classes in the first two sessions? For this, there is one principal reason, namely the darkening of our intellectual capacities following our fall from grace. So part of the punishment, right, of original sin is that the burning light that shone within the human intellect is slightly dimmer than it was, right? We have a darkening, not a turning off, right? God doesn't take our intellectual abilities back from us, but we do lose some of what we had, quite significantly. And I would like to leave you in this part with simply a quote from Fides et Ratio. Now, I recommended on your syllabus, for that terrifying syllabus at the beginning, that you take a look at John Paul II's magnificent encyclical, Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason. If you haven't done so already, may this be an invitation for you to do so, okay? Fides et Ratio is extraordinary. It's a beautiful document, but also it does a magnificent job of explaining precisely that which we've been discussing these past couple of weeks. And I quote, "According to the Apostle Paul, it was part of the original plan of creation that reason should, without difficulty, reach beyond the sensory data to the origin of all things, the Creator. But because of the disobedience by which man and woman chose to set themselves in full and absolute autonomy in relation to the one who had created them, this ready access to God the Creator diminished. This is the human condition vividly described by the book of Genesis, when it tells us that God placed the human being in the Garden of Eden, in the middle of which there stood the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The symbol was clear. Man was in no position to discern and decide for himself what was good and what was evil, but was constrained to appeal to a higher source. The blindness of pride deceived our first parents into thinking themselves sovereign and autonomous, and into thinking that they could ignore the knowledge which comes from God. All men and women were caught up in this primal disobedience, which so wounded reason that from then on, its path to full truth would be strewn with obstacles." So, the fall of man is, in a very real sense, about knowledge, right? So the language used in the scriptures is, they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that was their downfall. It is not that knowledge is bad, John Paul II is saying. Rather, it is that we need God, right? And that he means to elevate our knowledge so magnificently. He means to fill us, to flood us so totally, that our knowledge would be radiant. But today, we are in a different place. Prior to the fall, there would have been a certain connaturality. Now, that's a fancy word, but it basically just means habitual ease. So for all of you who are from Southern California, right, you have a connaturality with traffic, okay? You have a habitual ease of dealing with the 405, okay? It doesn't bother you. Meanwhile, some poor person from, Omaha comes here and thinks that this is the worst thing they've ever seen in their life, which it objectively is. But we deal with it, right? We have a connaturality, a habitual ease. And we would have had a connaturality or habitual ease with reason. Our reason would have moved from the sensory data of created realities to the Creator God easily, done it easily. We would have seen God rip through everything, right? And we would have gone from creation to him. But now we find ourselves in a far more difficult position, with the weakened intellectual ability to see the truth, and with wills often too feeble to move our intellects to adhere to the truth once we know it. And this has dramatic implications for our knowledge of God by both reason and faith, to which we turn now. So now you are on section 2, knowledge of God, de Deo uno. De Deo uno just means literally about the one God, right? So traditionally in Christian texts, especially in scholastic medieval texts, the means by which we study God is to move from the unity of God, de Deo uno, to the Trinity of God, de Deo trino. So the great texts, for instance, Aquinas' own study of this matter, begins with the study of the unity of God and moves to the Trinity of God. And there's a reason for that based in what we can know about God by reason alone. Given the fact that human reason is wounded by the fall, we might think that there is nothing that we can possibly know about God by our intellectual capabilities alone. That is, we might suppose that we are completely lost in darkness. However, it is in fact a solemn dogma, the highest level of teaching of the Catholic Church, that we can know about the existence and the attributes of the one God by the light of human reason alone. And why would that be? Well, one way to look at this is that while our intellectual capacity of reason is wounded, right, it is not destroyed by the fall. Okay? Remember, our intellect is dimmed, but God doesn't take our intellects from us, right? Our wills are wounded, but we still have freedom. The First Vatican Council, which is something not many of us talk about because we always talk about the Second Vatican Council, but the First Vatican Council took place in around 1870, and it teaches dogmatically, so at the highest level, in its dogmatic constitution, Dei Filius, which means the Son of God, and I quote, "The same Holy Mother Church holds and teaches that God, the source and end of all things, can be known with certainty from the consideration of created things, by the natural power of human reason. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. It is indeed thanks to this divine revelation that those matters concerning God which are not of themselves beyond the scope of human reason." What would the things beyond the scope of human reason be? Matters that God has to tell us about himself directly, such as the fact that God is triune, right? We cannot know that God is Trinity by the light of human reason alone. God has to tell us that because he's telling us about his interior life. But even in the present state of the human race, Vatican I says, God can be known by everyone with natural reason alone, get this, without difficulty, with firm certitude, and with no intermingling of error. So you can actually know that God exists. You can know some things about him, things that are not pertaining only to his interior life, which only he could possibly know about himself, right? We can know about God by the light of human reason alone. And I'm going to go through these things with you very slightly now, and I'm going to do a very poor job of this. So if any of you are professional philosophers, please forgive me in advance. So I would like to take you through one of the most brilliant attempts at looking at this that I am aware of, and that is Aquinas' so-called 5 proofs for the existence of God. Now, I want you to know that when we say proofs for the existence of God, we are not talking about proofs the way we talk about proofs now, right? Aquinas is not drawing up a mathematical formula on the board and says, taking us through it in a modern scientific proof. These are philosophical proofs, right? But they are very compelling. And again, I'm not a professional philosopher by any stretch of the imagination. Philosophy and theology, as we've learned, are not the same disciplines, and I'm not a philosopher, but I will do my best to take you through these. I think that they are very profound, and I also had a handout for you, but I was having computer issues, hence my arrival mere minutes before the class started today. So I will send that to Amy Rodriguez and get it for you online, okay, so that it will be to you somehow. In fact, I think that we can send it maybe through Eventbrite, but I'll figure it out. All right, so let's look at the first proof. This is what's called the argument from motion. Now, because we don't use motion in the same way, I just want to give a little excursus on what Aquinas means by motion. Aquinas, when talking about motion, is not talking about just, right, my moving from here to there, right? What Aquinas is talking about is the distinction between potentiality and actuality. Potentiality and actuality. So what is potency, right? You might say to a young child, he has the potential to be a great basketball player. But that potentiality needs to be realized, which we call actualized. So it needs to be reduced from potency to act. How does that happen? Well, the child practices, etc., etc. So potency and actuality mean things that could be and then things that are. And Aquinas uses the term motion to describe that. Okay? And which makes sense because you're moving from potency to act. You're taking the young child who doesn't know how to play basketball but who has a lot of talent, and you're making him into a good basketball player. Okay? So think about this then as the argument from potency and actuality. Some things in this world, Aquinas says, are evidently in motion. That is, they are actualized. They are in act. But nothing, notice, is in motion or in act unless it is put there by something already in motion or act. For motion, Aquinas says, is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. And notice, nothing can actually be in act unless it is put there by something that is already in act. So, if we take, for example, a wood pile doesn't set itself on fire, right? It doesn't just spontaneously combust, but rather it requires something already burning, such as a match, to make the wood pile burn as well. So a wood pile, we could speak of it as potentially on fire. Now, that sounds odd, right? A pile of wood, we don't say, look at that wood pile. It's potentially on fire, okay? But just think what it means is the wood pile could be on fire, right? And it is only actually on fire when something actually burning makes it light up. But notice that something cannot simultaneously be in act and in potentiality in the same way and at the same time. So our wood pile, our burning wood pile, right, is no longer potentially on fire, it's actually on fire. It cannot be said to be both potentially burning and actually burning. It's either burning or it's not, right? And once the burning wood pile is in act, what would we call it? We would call it potentially cold, okay? Now, but this sounds kind of silly, but this is philosophically magnificent, right? So something is either in act or in potency. It can't be cold and hot at the same time, right? Now, some of you might be scientists and tell me, well, yes, but in quantum theory, this could be this and that and the other thing. But remember, 13th century philosophical proof, Aquinas knew nothing of quantum theory, and I know nothing of quantum theory. Okay. So what this means, Aquinas says, is that the same thing cannot be both mover and moved. It cannot move itself. So a burning wood pile cannot make itself cold. It will either burn itself up and cease to be a wood pile. What will it become? Ashes, right? We're very comfortable with ashes here in Southern California, unfortunately. Or something will stop it from burning, like a fireman with a gigantic hose, right? Or one of those planes that comes in and dumps water. So a bucket of water, we could call that coldness in act, will make the wood pile go from potentially cold to actually cold. And now I'm going to give you a long quote by Aquinas. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another, if that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover. Seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand, therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. Now, that was a lot of moving and movers, okay? But let me briefly just say what it means, okay? Something in act can't be an act on its own. So, something had to make it go from potency to act. If we go on to infinity and just say, well, this was put in motion by this, and this was put in motion by that, and, right? Eventually, we need to stop somewhere. The buck must stop somewhere. And we must say, there must be someone who is always in motion, God, who can reduce the world from potency to act, who can bring it into existence. Okay. Second argument. The argument from the nature of the efficient cause. Efficient causes, by which Aquinas means things that effectively cause other things, right? So if I chuck my telephone, I'm not going to do this, I promise you. Across this room, I am the efficient cause of throwing my telephone across the schoolyard, right? That's what efficient causes mean. Another efficient cause would be a nail is hammered into a wall, right? But obviously, the nail doesn't hammer itself into the wall, right? You need a hammer to hammer a nail. But notice, just like in the first argument, we can't go on to infinity in the order of efficient causes. Because if you take away the first efficient cause, the first mover, you also take away all subsequent efficient causes. As Captain Von Trapp sings to Maria in The Sound of Music, nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. Right? Nothing comes from nothing, folks, right? You don't have something just go poof into existence, right? Nothing comes from nothing. If you start with nothing, you will end with nothing. Nothing never makes anything. Nothing is nothing. So, if there is no first cause, Aquinas says, among the efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate cause, right? If you don't have something that sets it all in motion and continues to set it in motion, then you're not going to have anything at the end of the line, nor anything in the middle of the line, right? You can't just keep saying, well, this was caused by this, and this caused by that, and that caused by that, and well, what about the first one, right? You cannot go back in an infinity of efficient causes without positing a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name of God. I think this one's my favorite. This is the argument from contingency and necessity. So in the world, there are things that are purely contingent. That is, they can be or not be because they come into being through generation, right? So all of us are contingent, right? None of you are necessary. I'm not necessary. Nothing is necessary. In where we are right now, nothing's necessary, right? So all of us got our being from something else. But what that means is that things that are contingent, like us, are not necessary. And I quote, therefore, everything is possible not to be. Then at one time, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence, right? So if all of us are contingent and nothing is necessary, then at one time we could posit that there was nothing. Well, what do we know about nothing? Okay, so if this is the case, then at one time there would have been nothing existing. And that would mean that nothing would now exist because nothing comes from nothing, right? Okay, but guess what, folks? Things do exist. And things exist that are not necessary, like me. Like that plant, right? Like my phone, which annoys me. Right. And so now, and I quote, this is Aquinas, we're going to have a lot of words. Therefore, not all beings are merely possible, but there must exist something, the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has already been proved with regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. And this all men speak of as God. So you see, Aquinas even says, look, even if you have a bunch of necessary things, they don't just have their necessity from nowhere, right? Something has to receive its necessity from something which is already necessary. So you have to have something because nothing comes from nothing. Okay. Fourth, the argument from gradations of perfection. In the world, we all know that there are things that are more perfect than other things. So, for example, Nobel Peace Prize winners are celebrated for their relative goodness, but always in comparison to an idea an objective idea of what goodness is, right? So if we had no mark, no standard for what goodness is, how could we award the Nobel Peace Prize? We couldn't. We wouldn't have any judgment as to what goodness is. We wouldn't know what goodness is. We'd have no standard, no ruler. But if we're talking about more or less perfect things, we are obviously comparing these things to something that has the maximum of perfection. As a thing, Aquinas says, is said to be hotter, according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest, right? So if you are comparing, say, Nobel Peace Prize winner A to Nobel Peace Prize winner B, and you're saying, gosh, they both won the Nobel Peace Prize, fantastic people. But look, she did this. She's a better Nobel Peace Prize winner than he is. Well, why? You're comparing it to that which is hottest. Aquinas says, now the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum of heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God, right? We have to have a ruler, a standard. If we're comparing things, we are comparing to a standard. There's a reason, right, why we all say Hitler is bad, right? If you take away, and this is a bit of an aside, I'm going to go into moral stuff here, but look, it is really, really hard to explain morality. I would say it's impossible to explain morality unless you posit the existence of a moral lawgiver, unless you posit that a ruler, an ultimate ruler for all things, because otherwise you, and again, I'm not a professional philosopher, but it's just very, very hard to condemn anything if you start doing that, right? We condemn Hitler because we say what he did was bad. But notice, just like with these arguments, right? If we're going to say what he did was bad, we have to compare it to that which is good, right? We have to have an objective standard from which Hitler fell big time. Take away that objective standard, and it becomes all a calculus of either pleasure and pain or power and lack thereof, right? It becomes what makes me happy, right? That killing people may have made Hitler happy. Doesn't make it right. Killing people may have given Hitler a sense of being truly powerful, but it doesn't make it right. Because the powerful don't determine what morality is, and also that which is pleasure, that which is pleasant and that which is painful also does not determine what morality is. Morality is objective because we compare it to a ruler, like a standard, and that standard is God. We are not going to get anywhere near what I thought we were going to get through today, but that's totally fine. We'll come back to it. So now we're going to talk about the argument from teleology, which is number 5. Teleology, by the way, just means an argument in terms of ends. So telos in Greek means end, like the goal towards which something points, right? So again, we all deal with teleology in our lives every day, right? You get up in the morning because you have an end in mind that you are seeking. Ultimately, that end is happiness. We're going to get there. But, right, even if it's just coffee, stat, right, which it is for me, okay? Anyone who is a sacristan at the 6:30 a.m. Mass, or who attends the 6:30 a.m. Mass, knows that Father William is barely conscious at the 6:30 a.m. Mass. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, okay? I'm not a morning person, but this is because I haven't reached my end of coffee yet. See, I obey the fast, okay? All right, so the argument from teleology. Natural things that are unintelligent, such as flowers, right? So there are wonderfully natural things all around us right here in this school courtyard where there are beautiful flowers, okay? Some of which you lovely people put up along the walls, which is beautiful. Flowers that are unintelligent act for a certain end. They all strive to live, right? They do so automatically. They reach out to the sun. Moreover, Aquinas says, these things achieve their end. in a designed manner and not chaotically, right? So notice, the flower moves up towards the sun, right? It doesn't collapse in on itself and go backwards randomly. No, all flowers are sort of programmed to move towards the sun, which is magnificent. Now Aquinas just briefly says, and I quote, "Now, whatever lacks intelligence, such as flowers, cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God." So Aquinas is just saying, natural things act for ends. Where did the heck they get that from, right? So the idea is not, I want to point out, okay, a simplistic, intelligent design account. We're not using God of the gaps here. We're not saying, oh, well, we don't yet have the ability to explain the eyeball, so we're just going to posit God right there, and he'll solve it all. No, that's not what Catholic theology is saying here, and that's not what Aquinas is saying, okay? Aquinas is simply pointing out that the world, the universe that God has created, is a magnificent complex of realities which are simultaneously caused themselves, meaning that they don't come into existence by their own, they are caused, but they are also in themselves causes because God has made it so, right? And if you want to think of this in a way that I find compelling, right? What is more difficult, to write a book or to write a book that can write itself? Okay? So it is much, much easier to write a book, although writing a book is torture. Trying to edit my dissertation into a book eventually. It's like pulling teeth. But anyhow, writing a book is one thing, but creating a book that can write itself is magnificent. And that's what we see in the created world. God has allowed this world to itself be a cause in its own right. It is a secondary cause because God causes it. But God causes it to cause other things. God makes a world that makes itself. It's pretty awesome, actually. Okay, now we are going to skip the ecumenical councils today because we don't have time to do the ecumenical, well, let's see what time is it. No, we do not have time to do the ecumenical councils justice by any stretch of the imagination, not that we were going to do a very brief survey anyway, but what I'm going to do is give you a brief survey about what the 4 levels of doctrine are, because we're going to talk about this when we talk about everything, and then I'm going to give you just a brief summary about what it is that Catholics believe about God. And remember, all of this seems incredibly minuscule in presentation because we have 10 sessions. So we're going to skim the water here, right? That I highly recommend, if you're interested in more of this stuff, to look at the textbooks that I recommended if you want to go deeper, because we simply cannot go very deep at all. So I want to talk to you about the 4 levels of doctrinal teaching in the church. And this is an aside from what we've been talking about thus far, but it's very important, especially for all doctrine. Okay, it's very important. And it's also, based on the questions that I received by email, I think that there's a lot of confusion in this regard, completely understandably. So first, let me just say, discipline means law, right? Discipline means law. But discipline often has doctrinal roots, but discipline is not the same as doctrine, okay? So an example of that is, let's use celibacy, right? It is an ancient discipline of the Latin West that all priests should be celibate. Why? The doctrinal root is because Christ is celibate, and celibacy is a consecration to Christ and a foretaste of the kingdom of God to come and the higher way of living one's life, because, as St. Paul says, the married man is concerned about many things, right? How to feed his family, for instance, but the priest can, in theory, devote himself entirely to God, right? I mean, priests, myself included, fail in devoting themselves entirely to God all the time, right? But we just call that sin, and then we go to confession, right? And I'm not talking about the gigantic things. I mean, just, if I want to read a novel by Stephen King, instead of maybe spending more time in prayer, one could argue that as a person consecrated to God, I could be using better. It's a bit of a joke, okay? But, because there's nothing wrong with reading Stephen King. Okay. 4 levels of doctrine, okay? But discipline, celibacy is a discipline, which means that if the Pope wanted to, he could get rid of it with a flick of the pen. And while you would hear a lot of people going, I can't believe this happened, right? It's a discipline, not a doctrine. Doesn't break anything, okay? So 4 levels of doctrinal teaching. The first level, and you have this on your handout, I believe. Is there Latin on your handout? I think there is. De fide credenda, is that on there?
Yes.
Perfect, okay. So the first level is de fide credenda, which means believed by faith. Believed by faith, okay? This means that the virtue of faith, the power of faith that God gives us, firstly, when does God infuse faith into us, folks? Baptism, right? So God gives us the virtue of faith in baptism, right? And things that we must believe by faith are things that faith enables us to believe and compels us to believe, okay? So these are absolutely infallible. This is the highest level of teaching. I'll give you 2 examples of that, both of these dogmatic, and taught in different ways. So, example 1 is the Immaculate Conception. That's a dogma of the faith. It is infallible. It was taught by the extraordinary magisterium of the Pope. So, I'm going to write that on the board. Extraordinary and ordinary. We're going to talk about this. In case those on YouTube couldn't hear that, it says extraordinary and ordinary. Extraordinary magisterium means the direct intervention of the Pope, who can teach unilaterally in the Catholic Church, and he can do so infallibly. So the Immaculate Conception is infallible, taught by the extraordinary magisterium of the Pope. Example 2. The incarnate Jesus Christ, right, the incarnate Word, is Mary's son. That's infallible. But that was not taught by the Pope, okay? That was taught by the whole church in ecumenical council. So we're going to look at ecumenical councils, not this time, but next time, okay? So the ordinary magisterium, part of the ordinary magisterium, would be when all the bishops gather in council and they teach something. They can teach. All the bishops in union with the Pope can teach truth, and it's infallible. So the fact that the incarnate Word is Mary's son is infallible by the ordinary magisterium of the church. Next level, de fide tenenda, not credenda, but tenenda. This means held by faith. Now, believed by faith is different than held by faith, but you don't need to worry about that distinction, okay? Because it's not something we really feel, okay? These things are also infallible, but they're simply less central to the faith than the first category, okay? They are totally infallible. These cannot change, okay? But they are less central to the faith than the first category. So I brought this up last time, but I'm going to bring it up again because this is where that falls, okay? Women cannot be ordained priests. That's infallible. That is not changing. When was that taught? That was taught by the ordinary magisterium, but not in council. It was simply the unchanging faith of the church. So the church has never done it, which means the ordinary magisterium has already taught it. It's done. It's infallible. The church has never done it, cannot ever do it, and has taught constantly in the teachings of the fathers, doctors, etc., that it cannot happen. So that's one way in which the church teaches, just simply the solemn faith of all time. Well, the solemn faith of all time is the solemn faith of all time. Can't change. And that doctrine was also confirmed by Pope St. John Paul II definitively in Ordinatio Sacerdotales, which is the document I mentioned last time and read to you from, which is just to say that this is part of the ordinary magisterium, the constant teaching of the church, But John Paul II, in order to remove doubt about that, confirmed that to be the case. Did he need to do so? No. But people were questioning it, and so he said, nope, this is part of the ordinary magisterium, part of the doctrine of the church from all time. We have no authority over it. All right, the next level. This has a Latin title as well, obsequium religiosum, okay? And what this means is religious submission of intellect and will, okay? Now, this is true stuff, okay? Just because it is a lower level doesn't mean it's false. It is authoritative and binding on all Catholics, but unlike the other two categories, it is more receptive to further clarification and specification, okay? Further clarification and specification. Now, I'm going to give another, because I like stirring the pot. As a theologian, it's fun. I'm going to give you an example of where this comes into play. I think this falls under the category of obsequium religiosum, and it is that artificial contraception is intrinsically evil, which means that no circumstance renders it acceptable morally. So this falls into that category, right? This is the most hated teaching in the church, but it is in fact a solemn and I would argue completely unchangeable teaching of the church. And now I want to explain why. So I would argue that this teaching about contraception is more than just, well, true, but maybe it's going to change, right? And why? I would say it's infallible for one main reason. Namely, why on earth would you be required as Catholics to submit your intellects and wills to something that isn't infallibly true? That would seem to do violence to the human person, right? If the church is saying, this is true, submit, right? That is pretty dramatic. And if you want to hold that the church is saying that about something that is not true, that seems to do violence to the human person. If we are being asked to submit our intellects and wills to something potentially false, that does violence to our dignity. But the church doesn't do violence to human dignity in her teachings. Therefore, this teaching must be infallible. Fourth, and then we're going to close, is the last section. We've already discussed this a little bit, okay? But the last level, I would argue, of church teaching is prudential judgments pertaining to applications of moral norms. There may be a Latin for this, but I don't know what it is, okay? And basically, that is, these things are open to discussion, okay? So, why would these things be open to discussion? Because they are prudential applications, prudential judgments, right? A judgment in prudence about an application of the moral norms in the present. So, for instance, Catholics can legitimately disagree with Pope Francis on the quote-unquote inadmissibility of the death penalty today. The requirement is merely that you must at least listen to what the Pope is saying and take his prudential instructions seriously. And the reason that these things are more open to discussion, again, is that they are based temporally. They're temporally based, right? This is true today. Well, what about tomorrow? What about yesterday? They are prudentially discerned applications of universal moral norms, given that they're temporally based, prudential, and that they are the applications of the magisterium, but in such a contextual way. They are not, in fact, binding on all times and places, nor are they universally binding on all people. And the example that I like to give for this with regard to the death penalty, and I'm not making a statement at all about what I think about the death penalty here, but rather just why Catholics can legitimately disagree on this, is that throughout the history of the church has in fact taught very significantly that death penalty is totally legitimate. And the Bible itself says that death penalty is legitimate. So the Pope certainly can't change that, right? What the Pope can say is, in today's context, it should not happen. But notice what the Pope is saying pertains to the West, to the developed West, and it pertains I think largely to Western Europe and to us. We can imprison people for life. We can remove the threat from the human community, from the common, from society. We can take the serial killer, put him in jail, and lock away the key forever. But in a third world country, in a developing nation, take a war-torn nation such as Somalia, if they have a serial killer who's a threat to the society, well, they may not be able to imprison him. Maybe the best thing to do is to remove that person, to remove the threat. Okay, thank you so much for your attention tonight. We're going to return to ecumenical councils tomorrow. I'm going to turn off the video and open it up for any questions that anyone might have.